In the heart of the Roman Empire, love became a weapon, beauty became a curse, and one boy's face became his death sentence. This is the story of how a man tried to resurrect the dead and destroyed the living in the process. There are moments in history when the veil between sanity and madness becomes so thin that an entire empire holds its breath. Ancient Rome in 67 AD was one of those moments. Walk through the Forum on any given day and you might witness something that defies comprehension. The Emperor Nero, ruler of 60 million souls, parading through the streets with his new bride. She is breathtaking, draped in silk and jewels, moving with practiced grace. But everyone knows the truth that whispers through the crowds like poison. That woman was born a boy. His name was Sporus, and what was done to him represents not just a historical footnote, but a meditation on the darkest capabilities of human power. Before we descend into this story, and it is a descent, if you're drawn to the hidden truths of history, the uncomfortable realities that textbooks omit, subscribe to this channel, because what you're about to witness isn't entertainment. It's a mirror held up to power itself. Comment below. What does it mean when love becomes indistinguishable from destruction? Here's what we forget about tyrants. They rarely start that way. Nero ascended to the throne at 16, practically a child, and Rome rejoiced. The early years showed promise, tax reforms, public entertainment, a young emperor who performed in theaters and seemed to genuinely love his people. Ancient historians describe those first years as something close to a golden age. But there's a psychological phenomenon that researchers call power paradox. The very traits that help someone gain power are the first things that power destroys. Empathy, restraint, the ability to hear the word no. Imagine being 17 years old and discovering that you are accountable to no one, not to gods, not to law, not to conscience. Every impulse can be indulged, every whim can be law. Every person becomes an object that exists only in relation to your desires. This is the alchemy by which power transforms humans into something else entirely. Perhaps this is why democracies were invented. Not because power corrupts, but because unchecked power reveals what was always dormant in the human psyche, the capacity to see other people as things.
Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she understood power in ways that Nero never could. Where Nero wielded power like a club, Poppaea wielded it like a scalpel, precise, calculated, invisible until the moment it cut. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty in Rome was common among aristocratic women. What made Poppaea different was her intelligence, her political instincts, her refusal to be merely decorative. When their affair began, Nero was married to Octavia, a cold, arranged marriage to the previous emperor's daughter. Poppaea represented escape. Not just from a loveless marriage, but from the suffocating expectations of imperial duty. But what started as passion mutated into something clinical psychiatrists would recognize today: obsessive love disorder. Nero didn't just love Poppaea. He needed to consume her, to possess every molecule of her being, to make her existence entirely dependent on and defined by his attention. Ancient sources describe behavior that would alarm modern psychologists. Nero stationed guards around Poppaea constantly, ostensibly for protection, but really for surveillance. He commissioned hundreds of portraits and sculptures. He would spend hours simply watching her, not interacting, just observing, as if she were a specimen rather than a person. This wasn't love. It was the confused desperation of someone who had never been told he couldn't own something he wanted. Modern psychology tells us that people who confuse love with possession usually experienced profound abandonment or lack of control in childhood. They spend their lives trying to freeze moments, to capture and control what terrifies them, the autonomy of another human being. For Nero, Poppaea was both salvation and proof that even an emperor cannot control everything.
65 AD. A domestic argument, the kind that happens in countless households across time and culture. But when one person holds absolute power and the other person refuses to be diminished by it, domestic arguments can end empires. The details vary depending on which ancient historian you trust. Tacitus says Poppaea criticized Nero's priorities, dared to suggest he cared more about his public image than his family. She was 8 months pregnant, carrying what might have been his heir, and perhaps pregnancy made her less willing to tolerate his increasingly erratic behavior. What happened next happened fast. Too fast for Nero to process what he was doing. A kick, or perhaps the sustained beating. Ancient sources disagree on the violence's duration, but agree on its outcome. Poppaea Sabina died of internal injuries within hours, taking with her the unborn child who might have stabilized Nero's crumbling psyche. Imagine that moment. The moment when you realize you've destroyed the one thing you actually loved. When you understand that all your power, 30 legions, infinite wealth, divine status in eastern provinces, means nothing against the finality of death. Ancient historians described what followed as pathetic, and they meant it literally. Nero threw himself on Poppaea's body, alternately begging forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if imperial authority could override mortality itself. Grief, someone once said, is love with nowhere to go. But Nero's grief was something darker. It was narcissistic injury. He hadn't just lost someone he loved. He had failed to control the narrative. And for someone whose entire identity was built on omnipotence, that failure was unbearable. So his mind broke. Not dramatically, but completely.
Nero's mourning violated every Roman custom. He refused cremation, instead having Poppaea's body embalmed, preserved like an Egyptian pharaoh. He declared her divine, established the cult, and spent days talking to her corpse as though she could answer. The imperial court now faced a terrifying reality. The emperor had detached from consensus reality, and survival meant participating in his delusion. Courtiers referred to Poppaea in present tense. Her favorite seat remained empty at banquets, place settings arranged as though she might arrive. Anyone suggesting the emperor move on disappeared, exiled if they were lucky, executed if they weren't. This is how autocracy breeds collective insanity. When one person's delusion becomes mandatory reality, truth itself becomes dangerous. Sporus was 14, maybe 15. Ancient sources are imprecise about ages of people considered unimportant. Born into slavery within the imperial household, freed as a child, educated for administrative work. This was actually privileged, better than most freeborn citizens. But privilege in an autocracy is really just proximity to power, which means proximity to danger. What made Sporus fatally special wasn't his intelligence or skill. It was an accident of bone structure. Multiple ancient historians note that Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea, particularly around the eyes and cheekbones. In a culture that believed physical resemblance indicated spiritual connection, this similarity would have seemed supernatural, like the universe offering Nero a second chance. The first time Nero saw Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in the emperor's fractured mind. Here was a way to undo the irreversible, to bring back what he destroyed. The resemblance was so striking that for a moment Nero probably actually believed he was seeing Poppaea's spirit in new form. There was, of course, one obvious problem. Sporus was male. But for a man who'd convinced himself he was divine, who'd spent months talking to a corpse, who'd made an entire empire pretend a dead woman was still alive, changing someone's biological sex seemed like a minor obstacle. This is the ultimate expression of objectification, when another person becomes merely raw material for your psychological needs, when their identity, their autonomy, their very body becomes negotiable because your grief demands it. Sporus wasn't seen as a human being with his own existence. He was a solution to Nero's problem.
What Nero ordered next represents one of history's most calculated cruelties. He summoned the finest physicians in Rome and commanded them to perform surgery on Sporus, irreversible modifications to make him appear more feminine. This wasn't just mutilation. It was the systematic destruction of someone's identity as a human being. Ancient surgical procedures were primitive, crude instruments, minimal anesthesia, significant risk of death from blood loss or infection. The process would have taken hours, with guards holding Sporus down, his screams unheard or deliberately ignored. But the physical surgery was just the beginning. Once Sporus recovered, a process taking months, the real transformation started. He was given a new name, Sabina, moved to special quarters, given an entire wardrobe designed to hide any remaining masculine characteristics. Then came the lessons. Master cosmetologists taught him to use kohl to enlarge his eyes, rouge for rosy cheeks, powders to soften facial angles. Hairdressers showed him elaborate styling techniques that took hours daily. Voice coaches worked to modify his speech patterns, teaching him to speak in higher registers and adopt feminine linguistic patterns. But perhaps most psychologically devastating were the behavioral lessons. Tutors taught him how to walk, sit, gesture in appropriately ladylike ways, how to hold his hands, position his feet, arrange his clothing, move through space conveying grace rather than strength. Every single lesson was an exercise in erasure. Imagine the psychological torture. Every morning waking to see a stranger in the mirror. Every lesson reminding you that your original self is being systematically deleted. Every piece of jewelry that once adorned a dead woman, now a shackle binding you to a role you never chose. Modern trauma psychology has a term for this: forced identity disruption. It's a torture technique more effective than physical pain because it attacks the core of personhood. The victim becomes an accomplice in their own erasure, actively performing their own destruction. This is what absolute power looks like when it encounters an obstacle. It doesn't negotiate. It remakes reality.
Spring 67 AD. Nero announced plans for a full imperial wedding ceremony. The preparations consumed months and enormous resources. The largest palace hall was transformed. Imported flowers, traditional Roman wedding decorations, musicians performing ceremonial songs. To outside observers who didn't know the complete story, it might have appeared like any imperial wedding. But those who knew understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and profoundly wrong. The ceremony included every traditional ritual: exchanging vows, joining hands, sharing sacred bread, signing legal documents. The guests played their parts with accomplished acting skills, offering congratulations while maintaining appropriate joy. But the atmosphere must have been suffocating. That particular tension that comes from participating in something fundamentally wrong while pretending everything is normal. Here was the most powerful man in the world publicly marrying a surgically modified teenage boy dressed as his dead wife and demanding everyone treat this obvious fiction as legitimate reality. This is how autocracy functions. It's not just about controlling behavior, it's about controlling perception, making people participate in lies so obvious that the participation itself becomes submission. When you force people to deny what they can plainly see, you're not just controlling their actions, you're controlling their reality.
Here's what haunts me about Sporus' story. Ancient historians were less interested in him as a person than as a symbol of imperial decadence. They recorded what was done to him, but not who he was before. We know nothing about his hopes, his dreams, what he wanted from life. All of that was erased the moment Nero decided he resembled Poppaea. From that point forward, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual. He became a canvas for someone else's twisted fantasies, a solution to someone else's grief, an object serving someone else's psychological needs. But here's what we can say with certainty. The fact that Sporus chose death over further humiliation suggests something profound. Somewhere beneath all the forced femininity, all the imperial conditioning, all the years of performing someone else's identity, some spark of his original self survived. His suicide was both tragedy and final act of defiance, a refusal to be degraded further, even at the cost of his life. In choosing his own death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing denied him throughout his adult life: agency. The power to make his own choice about his fate. 2,000 years later, what do we owe Sporus? Not pity. Pity reduces people to victims. Not just horror at what was done to him. Horror without understanding changes nothing. What we owe him is recognition. Recognition that behind every historical narrative of imperial grandeur, there are individual human stories of suffering and survival that deserve our attention and our compassion. We owe him the acknowledgement that his story isn't just ancient history. It's a meditation on power itself, what it does to those who wield it, and what it does to those who endure it. And it does so while convincing itself that this is what love looks like. Sporus' story reminds us that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's ownership.
Perhaps the saddest truth is this: we will never know who Sporus really was. We know only what was done to him. The boy he was before his transformation is lost to history, erased as completely as Nero intended. But in that final act, choosing death over degradation, he left us something. A reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, even when every choice has been stripped away, the human spirit retains one final freedom. The freedom to say, this far and no further. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about power, identity, and the human cost of history's grand narratives, subscribe to this channel, share this video, and in the comments, tell me, what does it mean to truly see someone, rather than what we want them to be?